Okay, welcome everyone to this first webinar from the Urban Wilding Hub, Urban Wilding Explained. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ross O'Kelly. I am an urban designer and a planner by background, but I've recently started this new non-profit organization called Urban Wilding Hub. Instead of sort of going through all the theory and the history, what I'd really like to do is to actually start by talking about some case studies and, you know, some really good projects that are happening that I think really encapsulate a lot of the possibilities of urban wilding. And then I think, you know, in the second half of the presentation, we'll talk a bit more about the kind of theory and the principles behind it. And hopefully that should give you a sort of good grounding in what I mean when I talk about urban wilding. So I guess many of you will be familiar with the term rewilding, and it probably conjures up images like this one from the fantastic artist Jeroen Helmer. This is a vision for the rewilding of the uplands in Britain. And you know, rewilding has really evolved over the last 30 plus years into what is now quite a mainstream concept. It obviously still faces challenges and criticisms, but it is something that is happening all across Europe and indeed across the world. There's now millions of millions of square kilometers, in fact, of land across the world being rewilded in some shape or form. And according to Rewilding Britain, what rewilding means is it's the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Rewilding seeks to reinstate natural processes and, where appropriate, missing species, allowing them to shape the landscape and the habitats within. So really, when we're talking about rewilding in rural areas, it's very much focused on large-scale landscapes and often with a focus on wild animals such as apex predators or large herbivores, which really require quite a lot of space. So it's natural that people would think, you know, this isn't actually possible to do rewilding within an urban context. But actually what we've seen really in the last 5 years and, you know, at an accelerating rate is this real interest in bringing the ideas of rewilding into towns and cities, into the urban environment. We have more and more now good academic literature about this phenomenon, and it's more and more coming into, we'll say, popular culture, but also industry practice and thinking about how this can actually work. Just to sort of talk about terminology here, you may have noticed that the name of my organization is Urban Wilding Hub, but we also talk about rewilding. So what's the difference here? I'm kind of, you know, happy for people to use the terminology that they prefer. Personally, in an urban context, I like to use wilding because rewilding suggests a return to a previous state. And a lot of early rewilding literature was really about looking at landscapes prior to human habitation or industrial civilization influence on our landscapes as a reference point. Now, in an urban environment, in a highly populated environment, that's not really so relevant, and I don't think really desirable either. And so by using the term wilding, I like this because it opens us up to actually future versions of the wild, future novel landscapes and novel ecosystems, which are much more appropriate for an urban context. So I want to kind of get stuck into looking at some projects. What does this actually mean in practice? Because the interesting thing about urban wilding is that while you know, while people have been debating whether it's even possible in cities, other people have just gone on and gotten ahead with actually delivering really, really great projects that are based in a rewilding philosophy. So what does that actually look like? The first couple of case studies I want to look at is the kind of less is more philosophy on wilding, or a passive wilding approach, where really it's about humans stepping back from the kind of domination and control and management that we put on urban landscapes and just letting vegetation grow, letting biodiversity come back on its own without too much of our influence. And this is quite, I think, a useful first step into the world of wilding. It's already a paradigm shift from how we typically manage, or we'll say, our urban parks, which is to mow the lawn every week or two, to spray pesticides, to remove weeds. But actually, if we actually set some areas aside and step back and allow that to grow, we can actually start to observe what a wilder approach might look like. So you might have seen, you know, this kind of thing happening in urban parks in many cities across Europe. Here's one example from Milan. the city has tested in a number of urban parks, setting aside certain locations where they're just not going to mow it quite so frequently. So they're mowing it once or twice a year instead of, we'll say, every month. And what the research says on this is that almost immediately you get an increase in the diversity and abundance of the invertebrate species, including important pollinators that will be using these new habitats. So City of Milan is rolling this out across 111 parks this year, covering cumulatively 1.7 square kilometers of total area. So it's little pockets of habitat, maybe stepping stones, but cumulatively it is adding up to quite a lot for essentially doing less work and spending less money. So that feels like it should be quite an easy sell to a lot of people. Actually going further and actually looking at a longer time horizon on this, there's an interesting example here that I think is very applicable to pretty much every city that has abandoned sites. And every city has abandoned brownfield sites where nature is starting to take back over, basically just due to lack of management. This is an example of a place where that played out over several decades. So Bethnal Green Nature Reserve in the heart of the East End in London was a World War II bomb site. It's a small site. And it was just left abandoned, fenced off for several decades, to the point where now it has succeeded into a sort of semi-mature woodland that is incredibly biodiverse in terms of tree species, the different, kind of complexity of vegetation that's there, huge amounts of different bird species that are spotted throughout the year that volunteers have been keeping track of. This is a pond that was created by volunteers, and there's now newts in there. So a really good sign that this is a healthy ecosystem that really developed from really nobody doing anything with it and just letting natural processes, take their time over several decades. And it's managed now by a charity. It's managed by volunteers, and it's a really important cultural and sort of nature connection site for that local community. I don't think you have to wait 70 years before, getting more involved in the management, but this is an example of over time how this can play out. Now, getting into the more active approach to wilding, and rewilding has been described as a marathon with a sprint start, because sometimes you want to go in and do a lot of interventions to begin with to sort of kickstart natural processes, but then step back and let nature take its course. So a couple of examples here, and not all of these, I guess the people behind them maybe wouldn't necessarily call them wilding, but I think it's interesting to think of them as part of a wilding philosophy. Some very interesting things happening in Paris as they are transitioning their city away from car dominance towards more sustainable modes of transport, but also finding space within the city for a lot more vegetation and biodiversity. So here's an example that many cities could replicate, which is taking a huge expanse, a concrete roundabout and a huge asphalt road, depaving that, bringing in soil and kickstarting a woodland on this site. Small site. This would have cost several million euros, would have been a lot of planning behind it, a lot of human intervention, but it's that sprint before the marathon. And hopefully it'll be interesting to follow this over time to see how much they can step back on the management and allow this to mature and what that means for the local area. But huge benefits in terms of cooling the air and providing stepping stone habitats for wildlife within the city. Now, hydrology is a huge topic when it comes to wilding, something that has been, over the centuries, we have dried up land, removed wetlands, we have channelized rivers into concrete channels or buried them underground, and we've lost a lot of the really important aquatic ecosystems that we could have in and around cities, that we did have. There's lots of good renaturalization, river renaturalization projects across the world. This one is in Munich. It is the River Isar in Munich. And going back to the 19th century, it was flooding, as rivers naturally do, which was a problem for the city. And so the engineers of the time did what they knew best, which was putting the river into a concrete channel and pushing the water as fast as possible out of the city. And this has played out all over, in London, in rivers and cities all across Europe. And this works for a while, but then you tend to get more devastating floods when you do burst the banks. And so it took many decades of planning and negotiation and finding funding. Eventually in the mid-90s, the city did manage this incredible comprehensive project to renaturalize the course of the river, to expand it, to reconnect it with its floodplain in parts. But it's also a much more, which helps with relieving flooding, but also it's now an ecosystem once again. So the river is clean enough for people to swim in. It's a huge recreational destination for people. But the real sign that it's a healthy ecosystem is that beavers have moved back into the river from the surrounding countryside, for their own free will. So for me, that's a great sign of wilding in action, setting the scene so that wildlife can come back on its own terms. Now, London has become something of the world's capital for rodent reintroductions. There's several good reintroductions of rodents back into the city. Sometimes people who aren't involved in ecology can feel quite squeamish around these kind of animals, but actually they play such important roles within ecosystems. And so from the smaller end in West London and Ealing, there's been harvest mice reintroductions. So that's that very cute animal on the left, back into an urban meadow habitat that was appropriate for them. And by putting them back in, a missing species back into that habitat, it means they are now being hunted by owls. And there's now resident owls in that park where there wasn't before. So that's a key rewilding concept of stitching back together food webs that has ripple effects beyond the individual species. Moving into the center image there is a water vole, and there's a fantastic water vole reintroduction project in Kingston in South London along an urban river. There's lots of water vole reintroductions happening across the UK because it's a very fast declining mammal due to habitat loss and due to invasive species like American mink. And so if we can get the habitat in an appropriate state for it, they're a great species who can go back in and happily coexist in an urban environment alongside human beings. And then finally, beavers. So I'm sure many of you have heard of beaver reintroductions in London. We have them in Ealing in West London, which is a very urban site, and then a more peri-urban site in North London in Enfield. And they've been really successful projects, not only in terms of bringing a lost species back into an appropriate habitat, but the beavers, through creating dams, are also reducing the flood risk. They're storing a lot of water on site, cleaning the water, and they're reducing the flood risk downstream in surrounding urban communities. So this is where rewilding projects or urban wilding projects can be really powerful climate adaptation and resilience projects as well as boosting biodiversity. And that map just on the top of the screen is the site in West London in Ealing. And you can see it's a large urban park, but it's surrounded by a very urban context. There's there's a retail park, there's suburban residential area, industry, and even a tube stop, a metro stop within walking distance. So that shows you how urban you can get with these kind of wilding projects. A final example here, looking more at the peri-urban scale. So just outside cities, maybe in greenbelt land or in adjoining land around cities. And this is a national park in the Netherlands. I have no idea how to pronounce the name, but you can read it on screen. And as you can see, this is a large, maybe a more traditional, typical rewilding project, but it is surrounded on three sides by urban areas, with Haarlem, the city of Haarlem, as sort of the largest one nearby. And so what that means is they've brought back free roaming groups of wild herbivores like European bison, conic ponies, even Highland cattle. And they've also allowed a lot of, a quite high population of people to have access to the site on a daily and weekly basis. So there's walking trails, there's cycling trails, there's a visitor center. So this isn't some sort of remote wilderness. This is, this is the countryside right outside a major city, but it is very wild and becoming wilder thanks to the positive impacts of these free roaming herbivores. All right, so that was your sort of whistle-stop tour of a couple of different examples and approaches to urban wilding. So let's get into a little bit more of the theory and the principles behind this, and hopefully that sort of helps everything kind of cement in your mind and also give you some things to take away if you're looking at your own sites or your own city. The first thing is, urban wilding. Do we have a definition of this? The truth is there's no kind of widely accepted and shared definition. As part of a research project last year, I asked 11 urban wilding practitioners what their definition of of urban wilding was, and I got 11 roughly different answers. And that's where we are at the moment. This is a young, evolving, fast-changing field, and there's work to be done to sort of come to more of a shared agreement of what we actually mean when we say wilding or rewilding within an urban context. And this is a conversation we're very keen to have. Excuse me. This is a conversation we're very keen to have at Urban Wilding Hub. And we have a kind of working definition that is always sort of being updated and changing. And that is that urban wilding is an approach to stewarding urban nature to restore ecological processes and promote healthy ecosystems with minimal human control. This is a dense packet of information, and I'll explain what I mean by certain terms here in the next couple of slides. But the reason that we want to push forward with urban wilding, we want to see this being a mainstream thing that is happening across Europe, I think was made clear in some of those examples, which is that it is a tested way of promoting biodiversity, recovering biodiversity, but also an incredible climate resilience and adaptation approach for relatively little money compared to more hard engineering approaches. But also we know from tons of research that, bringing people in contact with nature in a meaningful way on a daily basis, so important for health and well-being. And, there's an interesting way that can we figure out how to live alongside wildlife and wilder nature once again, for those of us in cities who are so often disconnected from us. And that's a huge opportunity, this human-wildlife coexistence piece. I'd invite you to think about urban wilding as being on a continuum. So sometimes I think it's tempting for people to want to draw a boundary around it and say, this is wilding and this is not wilding. And I'll give a couple of examples in the next couple of slides of things that I think, are definitely not wilding. But actually, I think it's, rather than gatekeeping the term and arguing about definitions, it's much more proactive to think about urban wilding being about making progress, not achieving perfection, because we'll never achieve perfection anyway. So it's about making progress towards bringing spaces from the left side of this graph, which is places with very little ecological processes, places that are fully urbanized, fully artificial, and then moving them further along to the right, where we can have reduced human control and more ecological processes, have biodiversity recovering. So, a typical urban park, again, it requires a lot of human management, and it doesn't really deliver for biodiversity or for those ecological processes. But if we can take these kind of spaces and move them further up towards being more semi-natural habitats, or what would be kind of the gold standard would be semi-wild landscapes with more intact food webs, reintroducing animals that are missing, renaturalizing the hydrology in the river, that's the progress. So it's not that everything has to be this example on the far right, but it's that we want to move spaces that are highly altered, highly managed further, excuse me, further along that continuum. So it's about making places wilder, not necessarily achieving some sort of perfection. Last couple of slides here, I'll kind of go through these fairly rapidly of kind of, from my perspective, what urban wilding is and what it is not, just to clarify, because sometimes I think the term is kind of misused to an extent or misunderstood. And this, I think, helps to clarify it. So fundamentally, as we've seen, it's about making places wilder. It's not simply a rebrand of typical urban greening projects. So, I come from an urban planning background. Phrases like urban greening and green infrastructure have played a really big role in bringing natural spaces and green spaces like more to the forefront of our urban planning and our policy making. But often they are delivered in ways that are quite species blind, that lack ecological literacy. And so there's a real quantitative aspect to a lot of urban greening projects where it's about delivering square meters of parks or delivering X many thousand trees planted. Urban wilding takes a much more qualitative approach, and it's very process-led. So it says, let's move the spaces that are highly managed, are highly altered, are not performing for biodiversity, and let's try and restore the ecological processes and see what happens from there. So I've mentioned this term ecological process a few times. You'll hear this all the time in the rewilding world, rewilding discussions. And I think if you can think about these three, taking away these three as, in your mind, goes a long way to understanding what we mean by ecological processes and restoring those. So there's a key paper by Perino et al. 2019 that puts forward a framework for rewilding should restore three key ecological processes. And these are, firstly, the dispersal of animals and plants. So if you think about, there's a lot of barriers, fences, roads, urban spaces that make it very difficult for animals and for seeds of plants to actually move through the landscape and to have that sort of habitat connectivity. The second one is what the researchers call trophic complexity, but in sort of more plain English, is about having complete food webs, or as complete as we can make them. So all the way from bacteria, fungi, and the sort of base of that pyramid, all the way up to the apex predators, the large herbivores, everything in between. Now, in an urban environment, we hopefully won't have wolves, bears, lynx. That just wouldn't be appropriate. But as we saw in some of the examples earlier on, piecing back in some of those appropriate species, safe species, can do wonders to start to knit together those food webs that have become, damaged over the years. And then finally, this idea of natural disturbance. So I think as humans in our brain, sometimes we think of disturbance as being innately bad. And, we want our landscapes to be kind of kept static and sort of managed in a way so nothing changes. And we think that's, that's things being healthy. But actually, if you look at real wild spaces and healthy ecosystems, there's change happening all the time. And there's a kind of intermediate level of disturbance that is optimal in terms of the ecosystem health and the biodiversity. So if we keep things static, the ecology gets kind of suffocated. But if we disturb things too much, for instance, by mowing the grass or plowing the land or weeding every time, some fresh vegetation comes up, we're also limiting the possibilities. And so there's an intermediate level where we have things like beavers, chopping down trees and creating dams, where we have, we'll say, European bison, going through a woodland and damaging some of the vegetation, where we have natural fires in, the south of Europe, where we have lightning strikes, or we have storm damage of trees falling over. These can seem like mindless destruction, but actually they're all part of the natural levels of disturbance that create opportunities for new growth, for microhabitats, etc. So that's a real mindset shift for, I think, people working in cities. So although these kind of three processes were sort of written about for capital R rewilding, large scale rural rewilding projects, we can adapt them very much to an urban environment, perhaps in limited ways, but we can also be creative about it as well. So one of the first ways is urban wilding is about reducing human control in landscapes where we have been very dominant and exerting far too much control and management onto a space. So typical example of an urban park or lawn that is mowed with very little biodiversity value, and just reducing that. And you can see in this image the area inside the fence, which is an exclosure. You have a huge abundance of vegetation that is recovering simply by being left alone. However, urban rewilding isn't the same as abandonment. And that's a kind of a myth I'd like to sort of clear up here. It's not simply locking the gate and walking away. This is a site near me, which is an abandoned brownfield site. And there's sites like this, in cities all over the world, which are abandoned for a couple of years before they're redeveloped. And they actually harbor quite interesting biodiversity. They have often very good for pollinators, sometimes very good habitat for particular reptiles. But, is this a place you would allow your child to go in and play? We don't know if there's broken glass or building rubble in there. And so what we could do is actually understand the benefits of ecology that are happening here, but step in and manage the space in a way so that it feels cared for, so that there's safe access, and that so the community can actually make use of it in sensitive ways, and actually be an educational tool as well. But also from an ecological point of view, naturally there is, again, those disturbance events. There's animals on the land. And so even in a small site like this, we would want to create that. We wouldn't want to just leave it kind of defaunated or without any a sort of animal or human input on it. So some urban rewilding Yes, it does sometimes involve reintroducing appropriate safe species, and these can be as small as a grasshopper or a type of beetle that is missing, all the way up to, we'll say, a heritage breed of livestock that can recreate the behavior of wild herbivores. But it's not about releasing dangerous animals in the city. This is something we have to be very mindful when we're communicating with the public about this, that this is an example of a heck breed of cattle, which is, can have, is being used in rewilding projects and can have a lot of, excuse me, can have a lot of beneficial impacts in terms of ecology, but their behavior is known to be aggressive. So you wouldn't put this in an urban park or a place where there'll be people walking their dogs or things like that. So it's just being sensible about these things and not, reassuring people that there won't be any sort of added danger. Some parts of Europe are having to deal with kind of, animals coming back, wild animals coming into the city of their own accord. This is kind of the ultimate rewilding, but it's actually not in a way that we want. So these are wild boars just looking very relaxed on a suburban street in Rome. Similar problems in Geneva, and I'm sure other cities around Europe, where wild boar populations have really rebounded in recent years. Seems like a good thing, but they're becoming more and more bold and looking for opportunities. Some of them are coming in cities, eating rubbish, and this is not ideal for them or for human residents either. So having this sort of level of rewilding where we have literally wild animals wandering the streets who could potentially be aggressive or could be injured, absolutely not what anyone is advocating for. Now, where you can't have wild animals or animals at all on the land, maybe a very small site or very constrained site, there are very interesting human management practices that we can do that actually mimics animal behavior. It's never quite as good as having the real thing, but this is a very interesting vein of urban wilding that I think deserves more explanation, more exploration. So if you can't have wild herbivores, let's say on the land, you can still do traditional grassland management. You don't have to get the mower out. You can use scything or some other kind of mechanical means to go in and reduce the level of the height of certain areas of grass. And in particular, if you do this in a really unprofessional and random way, even better. So you have some areas are left long, some areas are really short, and everything in between. And that kind of mimics the natural chaos of having herbivores on the land. Another example here, tree ring barking. So I mentioned earlier about bison or other animals that would actually damage trees, sometimes kill them, and that's okay. That's all part of kind of the natural processes. If we have, we'll say, a woodland that is a monoculture and we want to actually bring in more diversity, we can go in and actually do that ring barking ourselves to mimic wild animals, potentially killing some trees, but creating deadwood habitat and creating space for new growth to come through and to add more diversity. If we can't have beavers, we can just build similar dams ourselves. We don't have the benefit of working 24/7 as beavers do on these things, but it's a great volunteer activity and great fun and can be very effective. And then finally, this is an image from Cambridge. Some of you might be familiar with this, that Cambridge is one of the few places in the UK where the town's parks still have a kind of commonage function, and farmers will bring in their livestock at certain periods in the year to actually be on the land and eat the grass. And this is something that could, this is hundreds of years old. This is more of an agricultural practice. But if you have small urban sites and you can't have free roaming animals on them all year round, you can still bring them in for short bursts of activity, which will bring a lot of that natural disturbance and natural management, which could have a lot of benefits. Kind of on the final point here, which is that urban rewilding should be, in terms of a best practice way, done with communities. So the thing about doing wilding projects in an urban context is that we have hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of people who might be interacting with those spaces and who have an opinion on it and should be listened to, and probably also have a lot of good local knowledge that will enhance the project. And so, the successful urban wilding projects that I've seen all have paid a lot of attention to engaging, co-creating with local communities from a very early start and following through with that, until they have reams, often reams of volunteers from the local area who want to be involved in maybe doing some of that animal mimicry or other management aspects on the site, or doing biodiversity surveys. So a huge opportunity, not only to get people on board and get a positive reception to a project, but also for education, for outdoor activities that would really enrich people's lives. What we've seen is that when wilding projects are kind of implemented in a top-down way without bringing local people along, they can often face a lot of resistance. So we have an example here. I won't mention where this is, somewhere in the UK, where a local authority, being, with all the right intentions and being very forward-thinking, decided to implement rewilding principles on all of its public green spaces, which meant not cutting the grass as frequently as they had in the past. The problem was local residents maybe weren't properly engaged with this process and didn't know why it was happening, and they simply felt abandoned, and they felt like their neighborhoods were being allowed to slip into dereliction. And so what happened with a group here in a sort of suburban area is they actually got together as a community and took out their personal lawnmowers and mowed the grass areas that were being left long. So terrible for biodiversity, but you can kind of understand where they came from. They think they're doing the right thing here, and it's really can be very challenging to people's worldviews if they're not brought along carefully through a project. I want to finish on this point of climate resilience. So I've spoken, already about the potential benefits of wilding projects in terms of helping us adapt to climate change, to be more resilient to the effects of climate change. But urban, green spaces, natural spaces can only do that if they themselves are also resilient to a changing climate. And I just have one kind of example here from my experience. These are 3 urban green spaces from near where I live in Milan, Italy. These photos were all taken on the same day, the 1st of July, after a month of very high temperatures and low rainfall. And what you can see is that the traditional urban park on the left, which has the mowed lawn, has basically all the grass has died. It will have a much reduced function in terms of cooling the air. So if you stood in the middle, it would probably be the same temperature as if you stood in the road nearby. And also the soil is a hard pan. So, any sort of rainfall that does come is going to flow straight off that and potentially, exacerbating flood issues for nearby people. Whereas the green spaces that are more similar to natural habitats, we have an urban woodland here. It's about 30 years old. We have a planted wildflower meadow in a nearby urban park, and these are still absolutely thriving. So when you have this more wilder spaces, more diversity and more complexity, you straight away have more resilience to extreme weather, and that will be more and more important as we go forward. So the level of birdsong and insect activity in the woodland and the meadow was just orders of magnitude more than the sort of dying urban park. I appreciate that's all, I don't have hard data to back that up. That's just a kind of speaking from experience thing. But everything I've read about ecological science will kind of back up that hunch. So that's the end of that sort of main part of the presentation about urban wilding. I really hope that was enlightening and stimulated some thinking. I would love in about 5 minutes just to move to Q&A and discussion. So if you have any questions at the moment, feel free to pop those in the chat. You can see the chat button down the bottom right of your screen, and you can start putting in some questions or some thoughts or some reflections in there. That would be lovely. But just for the next couple of minutes, I just want to explain a bit more about what Urban Wilding Hub does and what we're trying to achieve. So we are really a brand new nonprofit, really just launched about a month ago. In terms of, staff, it's basically just me as the founder, but we do have about 7 volunteers who are giving their time freely. I'm also not being paid for this so far. We haven't got any funding in yet. We're such a new organization, but we do have a fantastic group of volunteers who are helping us with this. So looking to grow more in the future, but we are a new nonprofit for the urban wilding movement. the mission is really to try and scale urban wilding up from being a kind of niche activity to being in the mainstream, to being a normal and accepted way of how we manage urban nature, and seeing urban wilding projects happening in towns and cities across Europe because of the many benefits that we know that will bring. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we getting involved? Well, you know, from my sort of studying of this as a movement, I can see that there's really exciting projects happening. There's more and more interest in this, but it's largely happening in isolated pockets. And the big rewilding organizations like Rewilding Britain, Rewilding Europe, they are understandably focused on the large scale landscapes where they feel they can have the most impact. But that leaves the kind of small scale urban and peri-urban sites a little bit, you know, without any support or any direction. So that's the gap we're trying to fill. Is we're trying to get people together to work together to actually move forward in a more coordinated way. How are we doing this? Well, we're starting with things like this: running webinars, running knowledge exchange events. And we really want to see people learning a lot more from each other, which has been difficult in the past. Collaborating together and replicating successful projects so that we can get more and more projects happening. In the future, we'll also look to actually, get the, kind of codify some of that knowledge from practice through creating guidance and advocating for change through digital media. So our first program that we started with is called Wilding Partners. And this is where we're inviting anyone who's already involved in urban wilding projects or who's very motivated to get involved and to make one happen to join this kind of club, this kind of network. And the whole point is that we can come together, get to know each other, collaborate, and to share knowledge. So we'll be running monthly webinars between the Wilding Partners so that that knowledge sharing can happen. We have 29 partners so far, which are individuals or organizations from, I think, at least 3 countries at this point, 4 people who are based in Europe. So fantastic progress for 1 month, and that's only going to increase. If any of you are interested in joining, you'd be very, very welcome to, and it's a good time to join because we're going to have our first meeting in December on the 9th and the 11th. So I'll send out a link after this if you're interested in joining that. The other thing we're working on is there's no map, there's no sort of central database of all the urban wilding projects that are happening in Europe or that have happened. And so we're trying to crowdsource that at the moment. So this is just a zoomed in area of London where there is a lot of projects happening. And I know there's a lot more out there all across Europe of fantastic projects that could be added to this. So again, that's another kind of call to action for those of you who might be involved or know anyone who's involved in projects. It's very quick and easy. It takes 1 or 2 minutes to actually add your project onto it. And then it will also hopefully be a place for you to advertise what's happening and to start to attract people into your project. We've literally just at the start of this week launched our Knowledge Hub, which is on our website. It's a central database of free urban wilding resources in the form of articles, reports, research papers, also podcasts and videos. This was put together thanks to the hard work of a couple of our volunteers. They deserve a lot of thanks to kind of pull together all this really useful information and resources from across the web. So again, you can access that freely, and I really hope that helps people to sort of, upskill. And finally, just a call to action. If you're inspired by this, if you think it's something you want to be involved in, you can absolutely participate by becoming a Wilding partner or adding your project to the projects map. You can donate to our fundraising efforts. We're currently fundraising to cover our startup costs. We still need to get registered formally as a legal nonprofit. We need to cover our tech costs of just, running things like this. But also we can all advocate for change. So championing urban wilding in your work and pointing people towards our website, towards resources, and starting conversations that can lead to actually local action.